research by now. Finally, more subtle stuff, give the person the opportunity to drop out of the game, to secede from the game. Give the person the opportunity to not play against you, but to choose, I'll play against all these other individuals, but not that one. Begin to put that power in there, and you select for cooperation that much faster. So that's some good news. Final level at the group selection level. Group selection not in our behaving for the good of the species, but as we know, the more modern version of it, selection for traits that are only manifest at the level of whole groups. A always loses to B, but groups of A always defeat groups of B. All of the stuff we've been seeing, people suddenly cooperating with each other as a small group and driving the non-cooperators out of business, that's a group selection argument going on there. So you can have that as a means for generating a lot of cooperation. That's great. That makes the world a better place unless there's a downside to it. And back to chimpanzees. What do you have when a bunch of related chimps are having not individual fights with males from the next valley over, but functioning as a group? You are having an example of group selection, which thus brings up one of the most profoundly scary things on this planet, which is when you got a bunch of males who are getting along well with each other and they're beginning to look at the neighbors. Because lots of males cooperating together can make for some very bad neighbors, as some people in the field have emphasized. A decrease in homicide within a group is a prerequisite for inventing genocide between groups. So group selection is not always this magical founder effect of everybody wanting to learn the new folk songs. What you've got instead are circumstances where it can go very wrong. Final amazing example showing the emergence of cooperation. And this was not a game theory demonstration. This was not an experiment. This was a real event that happened, and an extraordinary one. This occurred during World War I. A lot of people have heard about a phenomenon that happened there, a historical incident that was very, very cool, but pales in comparison to what I'm about to tell about. In 1914, the first Christmas of World War I, somehow the decision was made that there was going to be a truce on Christmas Day. All of the fighting up and down the trenches was going to cease for 24 hours, and as has been documented, it was amazing and bizarre. Men out of the trenches playing soccer with each other from different sides. A bunch of German and French guys playing against some British and German guys on the other side. People exchanging gifts. People exchanging helmets as souvenirs. People singing together. People getting drunk together from the two opposite sides. And eventually, when the officers got them to go back to their job, they returned to trying to kill each other. Amazing, bizarre incident. What was very striking about it is it extended actually 2 or 3 days extra longer than planned because the officers couldn't get people to stop doing this. That's very cool, but that's an outside force already establishing the cooperation. Here's something much, much more impressive. And this happened in World War I, and it didn't take a bunch of generals or heads of states to negotiate a truce. The way in which truces would spontaneously emerge over and over again across the trenches. How do you generate a reciprocally altruistic cooperative relationship with the enemy in the trenches over there where you don't speak the same language and you don't even see their faces? Here's what you do. You take your best gunner and have him come up and lob a shell 20 yards behind the trench there and blow up a tree. Now have your gunner lob a shell to hit the exact same spot again. And do it again, and do it again, do it a bunch of times. What are you communicating to the other side? This guy's really good, and we're choosing not to put the missile down on top of you. What are you going to do about it? And then the other side would get out their best gunner and do the thing in return, and you have just worked out a non-aggression pact. And this occurred over and over again in the trench warfare, documented in letters by soldiers back home to parents saying, "Hi, Mom and Dad, things are okay here. I hope you're worrying less because we've worked out something. Things are a lot better here. There's a lot less people getting hurt." Working it out along those lines, working out a tit-for-tat vulnerability where you had to have a forgiving tit-for-tat. What if somebody messed up and accidentally dropped a shell into the trench on the other side? They got one shot back. Letters. Dear Mom and Dad, things are okay here. We had an incident the other day. We had this new gunner who didn't really understand how things work, and I heard he killed 4 people on their side. They shot one back. They took out 3 of our people, but everything is okay now. Tit for tat, complete with a forgiving element. This happened again and again and again in the trench warfare, and the only thing that stopped it from spreading is the fact that the officers kept insisting that nobody else was doing this, and these guys were going to get shot and court-martialed if they didn't stop this. And if they had only had cell phones, if they only had communication, if they only had a way of knowing up and down the line that everybody was doing this, they would have stopped the war. Not with a treaty, not with generals, not with heads of state, not with diplomats, but simply a bottom-up way of evolving cooperation, and they would have stopped the war if they knew that they weren't the only ones wanting to do this. Amazing historical incident. Okay, so this gets us to the end of aggression. As you probably noticed, this has gone on way long. This is the longest amount of material we spend on anything in the course, and each year it actually gets longer, and I actually think I know the reason for it. 3.5 lectures ago, where did I start off talking about my recent exposure to human aggression, which was my doing it and tripping up that jerk playing soccer, and everybody was all excited. Let me tell you about another time, the most serious time I have ever been exposed to human aggression. This took place when I was about 20, and this was the first year that I was doing research in East Africa. During that time, the famed notorious dictator Idi Amin was running Uganda, and he was a nightmare. He was just killing people left and right, destroying the country, as documented, cannibalizing. He was a nightmare of a dictator. Around the time, he made a mistake. This was spring of 1979, which is he invaded Tanzania and took over some of the land there, thinking the Tanzanians wouldn't fight back, and he miscalculated. The Tanzanian army counterattacked and drove them out of Uganda and decided to drive all the way up to Kampala, the capital of Uganda, and they overthrew Idi Amin. He fled the country, and the country was liberated. They continued through there, and they opened up a corridor to the Kenyan border, so it was now a swath all through the southern part of the country that was controlled by Tanzanians. So the day after the Tanzanians got things to the Kenyan border, I went into Uganda. Okay, why? This was like amazing. This was history happening. You were hearing, like on the BBC, that people were dancing in the streets in Kampala. They had been liberated. Amazing chance to see history. This was throughout college. I had been spending a lot of time with Quakers and wrestling with those issues, and figured if there is anything that counts as a just war, this would be it. What does this seem like? All these philosophical principles. This actually, of course, was not what was going on. I was a 20-year-old male, and somebody had been staying with me and no longer was, and I was all bummed out, and thus I did sort of a very 20-year-old male adolescent primate thing, which is figuring some violence would do some good things for my brain neurochemistry, and I wanted to go see a war. So I went off to Uganda, hitching through there, and it was appropriately exciting, and some things happened that scared the bejesus out of me. And at some point, I finally decided I have had enough. I want to get back to Kenya. I want to feel safe again. So I'm hitching back, but I had one last thing that I want to do, which was, since I was a kid, I had grown up reading about the explorers and the search for the source of the Nile and all of that. The source of the White Nile is in Uganda. It comes out of Lake Victoria in a town called Tororo, and there's a spot there, a bridge, where you can go and stand, and here is where the Nile River begins. And I had to see this before leaving, and I managed to get a ride into there, and I managed to get over to this bridge and stood there. And there was this sort of dam thing that was built, that this bridge was on top, and there was this sluice where all the water came spritzing out and starting the Nile, and I stood there and I looked over the side, and what I saw was there was a Ugandan soldier who had been taken down. There was a staircase along the side down to some sort of panel for controls or whatever, and a Ugandan soldier had been taken down the steps, his hands tied behind his back, and a rope tied around his throat and attached to the panel, so that as the water level rose, he would eventually be swept off his feet and would be strangled and drowned in the water. And this body had obviously been there for days. It was bloated. It was floating there. It was being bashed around on the waves. There were crocs trying to get at it. And looking at this guy, a total storm of emotions, thinking, good, that's what you deserve. We're being in the army for Amin. Then thinking, no, wait a second, this is probably some poor guy who was forced to do it and was just following orders. Then thinking, no, I know what I think of soldiers who just follow orders. Then thinking, whoa, I would love to get a lot closer and see what's happening down there, and thinking, I want to get as far away from here as possible. And I stood there for an hour and a half at that spot, staring at this guy until some Tanzanian soldiers chased me away from there. And I think now, 33 years later, that I lecture longer and longer about aggression each year because of that guy. What do we do here in our business? We have this general notion that if we are rational, if we are learned, if we are scholarly, if we respect thoughts and truth and all of that, we will make a world a better place. All of us who are professorial have somewhere in there this totally ridiculous belief that if you're allowed to lecture at a subject long enough, it will give up and go away, and that will be the cure for world aggression. If everybody can only be lectured to about the frontal cortex, it will solve world violence. But the basic problem is that aggression is such a messy set of behaviors. Schizophrenia, no question about it, bad news. Alzheimer's disease, childhood cancer, global warming, all of these unassailably bad news. But aggression is a whole lot more complicated because of that point where we started with, which is the same exact behaviors, and depending on the context, it could be something that will get a medal for someone you will want to mate with, vote for, reward, cheer on, join in, and in another setting, it is the most frightening possible thing that can happen to us, and it's the same behaviors in all those cases. And it's for that reason that violence is always going to be the hardest subject for us to understand biologically, and it's for that reason that it's always going to be the one we have to try hardest to understand. For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.